Hello everyone, and welcome to the next instalment of Three Hare Court's bite-sized employment guides, looking at issues arising out of the pandemic. My name's Emily Moore, I'm a barrister at Three Hare Court, and I'm here with Sara Ibrahim to talk about the topic of flexible working. Hi Sara.
Hi Emily, great to have you on board for this. So I think one of the topics we really wanted to discuss was flexible working, because over this lockdown period, people have been operating in a completely different way from normal. And I think both employees and employers have felt that there really has been some benefit to working flexibly. So we're going to be looking at how this will work and what kind of potential issues have been thrown up by it.
Yes, Sarah, I think from the perspective of employees, it's extremely likely that there will be an increase in flexible working requests for a whole range of reasons. So parents still navigating childcare arrangements and homeschooling arrangements, and then anxiety about commuting, or simply a reluctance to go back to the rigid way of working that we had before, being able to just work from home so flexibly. So Sara, what do you think in terms of the employer perspective? Why do you think that flexible working might be attractive from that perspective?
Well, I think employers have found there have been some real advantages to this new way of working. For some of them, very, very new indeed. So, for example, in the redundancy bite-sized videos, we touched upon the need for a lot of companies to reduce their overheads. And if you have a lot less people actually working physically from a central premises, you're going to be saving money. And I think that must be really attractive to businesses at the moment. But what do you think about some companies that have already been looking at working flexibly?
Well, it's certainly been heavily publicised that some of the big tech giants are really dominating when it comes to extending flexible work arrangements over a longer term period. So, for example, the likes of Facebook, MasterCard and Twitter have all made significant announcements in this regard. I think the most significant is probably Twitter. So the CEO announced that staff are going to be offered the option of working from home permanently. So I think that's pretty significant.
Really significant, a complete step change in the way that people are working. But just for those people who aren't legally trained, what is flexible working?
So, in a nutshell, flexible working is a way of working that suits an employee's needs. So, for example, having flexible start and finish times, job sharing, or also simply working from home. So the relevant legislation, it's Section 80F of the Employment Rights Act 96, gives employees the legal right to request flexible working for any reason. So employees can apply for a variation to the terms and conditions of their contract relating to, so firstly, the hours they're required to work, secondly, the times that they're required to work, and thirdly, where they're required to work. So that's a very brief summary of what flexible working actually is.
And there's obviously a qualification for who is entitled to apply for this. So we know it's about qualifying employees. So the first important point is it's employees rather than workers, but they have to have been continuously employed for 26 weeks. So most of your staff will probably qualify on that ground. But the other important point is they can't have actually made a flexible working request in the last year. So there will be some people who may have made flexible working requests just before the pandemic who won't be able to make another one within the year. So that's an important point, I think, for employers to be looking at.
Certainly, and I think another important point to note for both employers and employees is that while previously flexible working only applied to employees with caring responsibilities, since June 2014, qualifying employees can request a flexible working arrangement for any reason. So they don't actually have to specify the reason for their request in the application.
And just going to the process, because we know for employment law, a lot of the process is about showing that fairness is rooted in the system. And the guidance talks about requests being dealt with in a reasonable manner. ACAS has some very, very useful guidance that we can see online. So if you're working remotely, that's very, very easy to look at. But the other key components is it normally has to be done within a 3-month timescale. That means you need to respond within a 3-month timescale. So you need to, within that period, assess the advantages and disadvantages of that flexible working request. It's preferable to hold a meeting with your employee who's requesting it. That can be done remotely. As you and Emily, we're having a discussion remotely, so you can have a meeting in that way. And you need to offer an appeal process, because you may not come to an agreement on the basis of what they've proposed to you. But what about some reasons for refusal that a lot of employers tend to rely on?
So if you're an employer wanting to refuse one of these requests, you need a good business reason to do so, as you say. So there are 8 reasons that are prescribed by statute. And when refusing a request, an employer needs to give a sufficient explanation of which reason applies and why that reason has led to the request being refused. So some of the reasons are, for example, the burden of additional cost. Secondly, an inability to reorganise work among existing staff. Thirdly, an inability to recruit additional staff. I mean, the list goes on, and it may be slightly tedious for me to read them all out now. But Sara, what do you think are the most frequently used reasons by employers?
Well, we've had this conversation, Emily, and I think you and I were agreeing that the 2 which are very commonly relied on are detrimental impact on quality, the quality of work, and detrimental impact on performance. And we were both remarking that in this period of enforced remote working for an awful lot of people, it's going to be quite difficult, we thought, to rely on those in the same way that employers would have relied on them before.
Absolutely. I think that's clear. For example, if flexible working has gone extremely well for a certain business during the lockdown period, it's clearly going to be much harder for an employer to reject a flexible working request after lockdown by saying that they're concerned that it will detrimentally impact on performance. So thinking about responding to flexible working requests post-lockdown, Sara, I feel that topic may possibly send us over the time limit for this video. So perhaps we should leave that to a second segment. What do you think?
Yes, well, let's revisit exactly what employers ought to be looking at in a second video. Thanks, Emily.
Perfect. Thanks, Sara.